Hola, hola, ¿qué tal? And ¿qué onda? Welcome back to the Señora Power podcast. If you're wondering what this is all about, make sure to check out our first episode to get caught up. Today, we're building bridges, making connections between two of our amazing señoras. If you're wondering when all of this that we're going to talk about went down, this episode spans from the 1920s through the 1970s. While Señora Carmen Cortés is an earlier figure, our honorary Señora Gloria Arellanes was making moves later on in the 60s and 70s, and even today. So just going to mention some keywords that not everyone might use in everyday language. So we have talked a little bit about in previous episodes intersectionality, respectability, political consciousness. So what's that? So I'll just give a description. Intersectionality more or less talks about how each of us is a complex person, right? I'm a woman, I'm Latina. I can be a lot of different things. And that's what is described in intersectionality. So we're not just going to see me as Latina or woman or student or worker, right? We're going to see me as all of these things. And we see our señoras as all of the things that they were too. Respectability is a word that we use that comes from a scholar, Evelyn Higginbotham, in the 90s, that talks about how sometimes if you're in certain groups, you might want to appear more respectable, more respected in your community and outside of your community in order to gain more resources or in order to gain status in your community, which is part of the way that you survive in your day-to-day life. So these things are really complex, like respectability. It shows up in different ways in different people's lives. And our señoras definitely mobilize it to make sure that they survive and their families survive. And so part of what we're doing when we look at this is analyzing that part of it too. And finally, political consciousness. That's something that will come up a lot in our podcast. It is this kind of thought process, identity, consciousness that we have around politics, yes, like, elections or what the politician in your state is doing. For sure. But it also has to do with what your education, what your knowledge, what your thought process or your opinions are about the politics that happen in your community as well. Like, how are people organizing around certain issues? Like, are they going out on the streets? Are they not? Are you going out on the streets? Are you not? What is your identity and why do you feel like it's your identity? All of this has to do with political consciousness. Let's dive into the world of social clubs, social circles, and social power.
A ti te dedico mis versos, mi ser, mis victorias. A ti mi respeto, señora, señora, señora.
I can start us off with a quick recap of the first social señora that we talked about in this episode series. Señora Carmen Cortés, she's the first of our social señoras. She was born in 1913 and really became a social señora in the late 20s, early 30s in the affluent Mexican American societies of Houston. She was LULAC's national secretary for a number of years, the very first woman of Mexican American descent to hold a white collar job in Houston in the 40s. And overall, an organizer of parties, a fancy lady, and someone who builds community through friendships and through social events.
And our second señora is Gloria Arellanes. She was born in 1946 in East LA, but she moved out to El Monte pretty early in her life and she spent most of it there. She's one of our more well-known señoras, one of the first female brown berets, and as a part of this paramilitary organization, she established El Barrio Free Clinic. And then later, when she left the Brown Berets, she established the short-lived Adelitas del Aslan, a Chicana activist group. Perhaps to some, it might seem strange to call her a social señora because she wasn't exactly like a loud advocate for debutante balls, but I'm really excited to dig into the way social power overlaps in her story and with Señora Cortés.
Awesome. So, do we want to get started with some questions? So we can chat about the relationship between these two señoras, the relationship between their ideas, between their time periods. Let's make some connections.
Do it.
Sonia?
Sure, I can go first. My question that I want to help us connect these two señoras who seem very different in many ways, is about their family ties and the way that their networks help them become resilient in our survival strategies. So my question is, how do Señora Carmen and Señora Gloria's networks of relationships define them and their mechanisms of survival, their methods to keep going?
I like this question, especially for our social señoras, right? It's all about who they know, who they hang out with. And this is what sort of lets us into how their political consciousness was shaped overall. I mean, I think that it's always true that any person is a social being, right? So it's important to figure out who is influencing and shaping our ideas. And for these señoras, I mean, two very different time periods, two very different communities that they were a part of, but both of them facing the task of self-identification. And self-identification as a group. I think that most of our señoras are dealing with that in many different periods throughout history. But for these señoras especially, I mean, it's all about making connections across different clubs, right? We talked a lot about the clubs that they were a part of, but we have to remember that this was in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 60s. Social media wasn't a thing back then. So communication and upkeeping of networks was so important. And I think that these señoras really show us how to do that in a very intentional way.
Yeah, I think that part of the humans as social beings thing, like you were saying, Sophie, I agree. And I think it's that kind of like survival skill to find your people, to find a way to create like a parallel system to a system that might not be catering to you already, right? So like I think that concretely in the case of Carmen Cortez, right, it was one type of social structure, this debutante club, or later on even like a club of like mothers in that area in Houston. These are groups of support for people who did not necessarily have support built in already within existing institutions, such as like education institutions, so school. Like a lot of these señoras maybe didn't go to a lot of school, so like how are they going to get support from there? Or the police forces, maybe they weren't really supporting them necessarily in their day-to-day lives. The church might have formed like a type of structure for people to get friends through, but I think in the end it was these friends, these señoras in the debutante clubs, like, oh, I'm going to support you to be able to have a happy life, to like find your way to health and happiness or whatever. And I think that's really powerful because it also found a way to empower women to find the positions that they were able to fill, right? For example, higher positions in LULAC than women had held before. And that kind of like finding your niche within your community is, I think, so powerful because if you can get your own community to listen to you, then that kind of organizing work is enough to get other structures outside of your community to listen to you. And that's essentially what Gloria was doing too, in a more, I think, like what we traditionally think of activisty or activist, like, right, going out and protesting and all of those things. Gloria Arellanes was right there in East LA doing that. But also, I think the fact that she thought very fondly about her free clinic project is a huge deal because that had to do with people in the community trusting her. Like, oh, I saw her grow up, for example, or, oh, like, I know that she's honest, or like, I know she has our best interests at heart. I know, Sonia, that you told an anecdote about how Some men in the movement were like using that place kind of for their own things, like the free clinic space for their own stuff. And Gloria Arellanes was like, no, this actually is no longer just your space. It's the community's space. And in the community's best interest does not include you doing your stuff here. And so I think that that's really powerful because she was able to, I guess, create literally a space for the whole community to feel safe in. And that's like the only thing I can think of when I think of that is both like it's like resilience and it's like survival, and all of that it was able to happen because of trust, and because people knew who she was. And I think so Carmen and Gloria, you know, having these networks of people meant survival not just for themselves but like the safety of their communities. So being social was actually like kind of heroic in a way.
Do y'all think that there is some generational differences here that we can highlight to show a sort of development with the socializing as a survival strategy? Just thinking about Carmen being essentially like Gloria's mom's vibes and like ideologies, and Carmen taking part in these debutante balls and these clubs that are really trying to teach you like how to be a wife, and focusing a lot on maybe what we would think of more as like traditional roles for women of Mexican descent. Because Carmen and Gloria's mom were doing that work, do either of you see a development there between generations of this networking?
I mean, I think there's just like historically, if you look at like the differences, right? Like, there's in the 1960s, there's the Chicano movement, which created the vocabulary for a lot of young Mexican American people to understand their identity based on a political concept, right? So what we were talking about at the top of this episode, political consciousness, it created the possibility to have a political consciousness. However, if we like break it down into the building blocks of what that means, Gloria had a concept already since like a young child of what it meant to be marginalized, for example, what it meant to not have access to the same resources that maybe her white peers around her had maybe. So that those are the building blocks of political consciousness as well, is like what bothers you in your life, like what do you not have access to, what are you pushing towards? And in that regard, Carmen probably had that concept as well. I mean, when she talks about like being part of the Mexican American community or the Mexican community in Houston, there's a great acknowledgement of segregation. Like the fact that Mexicans in Houston were only allowed to be in certain places, only allowed to worship in certain churches. I mean, that's segregation, and that consciousness like happens from a very young age, from when you're told like, no, you can't because of who you were born to be or who you are. And so in that sense, I think Carmen had a certain political consciousness that led her even to join LULAC. That kind of tie, you can see that like link. And so Gloria and Carmen being one generation before Gloria, Carmen had a certain like amount of possibilities, right? Like no one was out here saying, oh, you know, Cesar Chavez, who's organizing farm workers, like, and you are like those farm workers in a way. But she had the idea of like, I grew up in this place and I don't have access to certain things. So with the things I do have access to, how can we make our lives like the best that they can be? And the fact that she helped create things that weren't there already tells me that she had enough of a political consciousness to envision a different future for her community. So in a way, Gloria and Carmen are like very similar. And I think that you see the generational shift because when you do have a vocabulary for things, you might be able to step forward more into the like spotlight. You may be able to speak with more confidence, like in the press, about your situation. When you don't have vocabulary, or when you perceive that your community is the only one that's going through this, it might be a more tentative thing, or it might be like moving within the lines that you know, within the rules that you know.
Yeah, and I guess to keep thinking about the generational differences, but also matching it up to the particular political context in which these women were living their lives, right? I think that obviously there's going to be differences in the end goals of their political consciousness. For Carmen, I see very concretely this need to present a solid community with resources who can, be respectable, to come back to one of our keywords, right? Who can look a particular way, who has access to a particular kind of resources. For Señora Carmen, it was very class-based, I feel. Whereas for Gloria, there's always the gendered aspect that stands out for me the most, which is, to claim a position, to claim visibility within the broader, very masculinist leaning Chicano movement, right? But I think that underlying these different like end goals or different sort of political contexts, the thing that stands out for me with both of our social señoras is their strategies for doing this, right? It's not just about throwing the best party and like having like the fanciest food or whatever, or like or organizing the biggest march or anything like that. I think that at the bottom of it, their strategy is to simply show up and see what you can do once you're there. You first show up, you first sort of like claim a space for yourself where it had been denied to you before, perhaps. We've talked about segregation in Carmen's case, but we're also talking about gender exclusion in Gloria's case. So I think that part of using your networks as a survival strategy is to just show up with your network.
What's your take on your question?
I think that y'all have already said my take, but I would add something that we will probably touch on with all of our conversations, but the different geographies I think add something here as well. So generationally and then geographically, so generations across geographies. In Texas, it feels like Carmen Cortez is like the first to do certain things. The first to be, the secretary for the mayor, the first to be this thing for Lulek and that thing for her community. She's really sort of like setting standards in a lot of different ways. And that's why, because she's setting standards, she's so invested in respectability. And that's how Texas was sort of organizing its Mexican communities, right? And so I think that Texas basedness sets Carmen apart generationally and then geographically from what was happening in California. Because thinking about Gloria's case, before she got involved with the Brown Berets and after, she was a child sort of involved with Elks Club, she worked at Teen Post, which we know Lupe Anguiano set up years prior to that. So there's something in California where she wasn't having to make it all up on her own, basically. The ball had started rolling in California for her to show up, as Sophia is saying, to borrow those words, to show up with her community, with her networks, and to create El Barrio Free Clinic. Even to just join the Brown Berets, she met people at Teen Post, went to the coffee house, and then met some of the most iconic Brown Berets that we know to this day who were establishing the Chicano moratorium. And so because Lupe created Teen Post, she was able to do that. Whereas in Houston, it wasn't that way. Carmen didn't have something like that to enter into. I think generationally, that's different as well in Texas versus in California.
I think because we're talking about generations or thinking about the señoras in their generational divide, then we can think about how each of them considered themselves in a gendered capacity, because that's a huge part, I think, of not being a man is like living the world through a very gendered experience. Everyone does that. Everyone lives their experience through a gendered lens. However, for people who are not men, it ends up being something that is told to you over and over and over again in professional spaces. And in the time period, so like the 20s, 30s, 60s, 70s, both of those were very like intense moments for understanding gender in the Americas. So I did want to just quickly lead us through the idea of what kind of feminisms these two señoras might have been exposed to, even without, maybe for Carmen, even without knowing or like without really seeking out the idea of feminism, like this might have been what she was exposed to in current events of her day or right before her time. Carmen would have been exposed to something like first wave feminism, which actually began slightly before the 20th century and focused mostly on suffragism. So what that means is like women were fighting for women to have the right to vote. However, some things to consider about this moment was that it was mostly for middle and upper class women, mostly for white women. There was a very strong Latin American first wave feminism movement that mostly centered in Mexico. There was some in Argentina and Brazil as well, but for our purposes, the Mexican first wave feminist kind of movement definitely centered the most on upper class women, talked about suffragism, like as in the right to vote, and followed the same or similar trends as in the US, where it had to do a lot with like charity, abolitionism in the US, for example, movements against drinking alcohol. All of those things were precursors or gathered these women together to create first wave feminism. So that's what Carmen would have been exposed to. And in that vein, we can see that there's like similarities, I think, with her social club work. Second wave feminism is right at the time that Gloria would have been with the Brown Berets and like right after. So second wave feminism starts in the 60s, goes around early 80s, and focuses the most on getting women out of violent, intimate relationships and getting women resources to be independent from maybe their husbands if they were being mistreated, or even like if their husbands passed away, to be independent. So this second wave feminism still worked under the understanding, because this was socially how the majority worked, the understanding that women were financially reliant on men. So how can we change that paradigm was a lot the question of second wave feminism. However, second wave feminism was still very focused on middle upper class, but mostly just generally white women in the US and in Europe as well. Europe had their own version of this, but we're looking specifically at the US and just anecdotally looking at documents from LA chapters of the National Organization for Women. The leader here in LA wrote in like the 70s, yeah, so the Black and Latina women have to get their stuff together before they're even before we even think about including them in our movement. So it was very clear that Latinas were excluded, Black women were excluded, Asian American women were excluded from these kinds of organizations. And that's why when you look at Gloria's philosophy on what it means to not be a man, there's a kind of radicalness to it that I think doesn't necessarily fit within a lot of second wave feminist ideologies. So I was gonna ask you all how you see Señora Cortés and Señora Arellanes either moving within the feminisms of their time or butting up against the models of feminism. How do you see them either as replicating their moments or as visionaries outside of that?
I can share a little bit about how I read Señora Carmen, since she's part of this like first wave kind of feminism that we're identifying. I think that for the most part she does fall within like the ideology of this first wave of feminism, right? Which is political participation, which is, you know, having a say, becoming an actual person in the eyes of the law, you know. So I think that she's definitely fighting for that kind of recognition. But I also think that neither of our señoras, maybe this is a spicy take, I don't think either of our señoras really falls within these two waves of feminism. I think that they're both in their own way visionaries. And just like speaking about Señora Carmen, she was already, like we've mentioned before, she was the first woman who worked this white collar job. She was the first woman secretary of this big national organization. prior to this moment where, we're pushing women to go out into the workforce. I mean, she did it based on resources that had already been established primarily for white women to participate in society, right? Specifically for white Christian women, she was a part of the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA. This is where she would take her business classes. This is where she would take her citizenship classes, where she would stage the meetings for Club Chapultepec, for Club Mexico Bello. All of this was possible only because of these institutions that were kind of already in place. However, this is the early 30s that we're talking about, and she's already talking about establishing classes for women to become quote unquote better citizens, which at that point just means become part of the labor force, become part of, the everyday life of people in a segregated world, to become visible within this part of society, right? So I think she's a visionary in that way. I don't think she sticks to first wave concerns too much. I think she does go out of her way based on necessity, right? Based on need, but also just based on grit and ambition.
I agree with that. To speak to Gloria, I was thinking of those phrases that often define feminism, where there's like the traditional phrase of a woman's place is in the home. And then second wave feminism sort of flipped that saying to say a woman's place is in the revolution. And I think that Gloria very much embodies that, like literally the civil rights revolution of the Chicano movement. She took part in revolutionary events like the Poor People's Campaign with Martin Luther King Jr. Whenever she established the El Barrio Free Clinic, her emphasis on sex education and providing resources for safe sex is also a little second wavy. What I think she is a revolutionary for the revolutionaries on, like something that she was doing that pushed her beyond second wave feminism, is thinking about, well, I mean, there's so many Chicanos who are socialists, really. They were like really into like Che, and and Lenin.
Yeah, that's part of being the Chicana versus Mexican American, right?
It is. And she was like, no, socialism. We need free medical care. We need better social programming. Like she was full in. I would say she was pretty radical in that sense. I guess third wave is sort of based in sexuality. So because she was able to speak against the abstinence narrative that dominated Mexican American families for such a long time, and really still does, then maybe she was sort of like pushing forward in that way. And also, she was a single mother. And it's hard to know if in the time she was thinking these things, but in her oral histories, at least, when she's had some time to digest it, she was really forward thinking in this idea of like, single motherhood is not the evils, the perils of society, which was the narrative for so long, that bad situations come out of a single parent household, and specifically when there's not a father to take charge. And she rejected that narrative in a lot of different ways. And I think she even talks about in her oral history that didn't even like want money from him. Like she sort of refused to even take part. They didn't even like marry. She was never married. She had these children out of wedlock. So like that alone, I think, is a little bit revolutionary for her time. But she does fit pretty well into second wave feminism.
I think it's super interesting, Sonia, that you're making that connection between like single motherhood and like third wave kind of stuff. This reminds me of a similar part of history in terms of African American activism. I'm reminded of this report that came out in 1965. It's called the Moynihan Report, but it basically is talking about the structure of the African American family. And, it pretends to be this kind of like sociological ethnography explaining, all of the ills and wrongs with African American people to that point. And one of the things that they're pointing out is, non-traditional nuclear family kind of dynamics, including single mothers, right? So I mean, not only is she making a third wavy kind of feminist statement, she's also making a cross-racial kind of connections in identifying this as like one of the many tools that people have used to like demonize the non-white families or racialized people in general, I guess.
This is really reminding me also of like the social welfare conversation, which we will come back to. When I read all of the official government documents about social welfare that had to do with single mother households, I almost like, I don't know why it was still so shocking to me, but the language used is very shocking. It's dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing. And I think that what you get when someone like Gloria is able to speak articulately to a broader audience is that you are effectively going against that narrative of dehumanization. If a single mother is making these arguments, is setting up a clinic, is like, has set up a clinic, for example, is participating in political movements, then how can you say, all of those things? I mean, baseline, you can't say that, right? Like baseline, it's already wrong. But I think that that's part of like a large part of the argument for representation at this time, and a large part of why it's so important even still that these señoras stories be told, because I think that sometimes people like to make the argument, whether overt or covert, that we need to historically emplace what we're talking about, that like feminism didn't exist before, or that like the idea that women are people is something that's actually like quite recent, even if they say, oh, but I don't believe that, right? But I think that looking at these señoras and the fact that they always had the concept of we deserve more, our community deserves more, and we are people, and we can be enough of a parent to be a single mother, right? Like, and still raise our children well. I think that that's always been an idea that women have had, that people have had. And looking at these women's stories, I think is really important, because you can't just erase them, even though it's been attempted over and over again.
Yeah, I think you actually did some helpful work there. Both of you did. But it was making me think of when we talk about like narratives, we often mean what people are saying, like the discourse, the discussion, what maybe media, like newspapers, TV reporters are saying. But I think because of like what we do as careers, we also mean laws. We also mean like legally binding things that dictate what you actually can do. And so like narratives becomes like this big catch-all, but like around the legalities of single motherhood and the ways that the US put up so many barriers to success in order to sort of dissuade women from breaking free from the nuclear family.
I mean, speaking of visibility, I think we might have another question.
Yeah, I was about to say this is a great moment to think about showing up in both its I think we've been talking about it in a positive way, right? Now I think I want to challenge us to think about maybe like the cons of being visible in this way. So, in thinking about our social señoras, we've discussed visibility in terms of, being a chica popular, right? Being someone who is known in society, trusted in society. This kind of visibility leads her to her first white collar job. This leads her to her job with LULAC. This leads her to organizing galas and fundraisers and the annual quinceañera or the debutante ball, things like this, right? And in terms of Gloria, I mean, we've talked about obviously her activism. We've talked also about her own parents' engagement in this previous generation of social clubs and how that might have influenced her. So, in thinking about visibility as a resource, the easy question would be, what do we gain with visibility? What is at stake with making the group known, with making ourselves known? But are there any downsides to visibility in a political sense, in a personal sense? Can we think of reasons why señoras might prefer to stay invisible or perhaps only be visible to certain people. Is visibility a strategy?
Yes, visibility is definitely a strategy, especially for women who, thinking back to the feminism conversation, were considered subservient to be in the domestic sphere only, to be wives and mothers. Visibility in ways outside of those roles is a strategy and is a risk as well.
Yeah, I mean, I also think going back to the idea of like the dangers, for example, of visibility. It's, we talk about Gloria Reganes and we talk about Carmen Cortez because they're women who are willing to speak out, to put their faces to a movement or to a moment or to a club, right? They're willing to be public people. But I think that there's so many other people, like as well as them, who we don't actually know about because they chose not to be public. And I think that now, in the moment, like in this moment that we're living of like the internet, where people can say whatever they want about you and feel a kind of authority over you because they're seeing you on a screen, for example, or they're hearing your voice in a podcast. Um, because of these things, people feel that they have a relationship with the people behind the screen when really they don't. And making yourself a public person, we know the perils of that right now. But in the past, in these moments, for these specific reasons, there were real and concrete like dangers to speaking out, especially as a woman. You could get criticized, as not being feminine, for example. And that's not just like an insult that could reflect poorly on your entire family, right? Like that could limit the resources that you could get. And especially if you were seen as like strange, if you relied on your community and nobody wanted to work with you, listen to you, give you things, then that's very concretely endangering your ability to gain resources. So on that side, on the side for Gloria as well, like, being this outspoken person who is like, I'm a single mother, I'm okay with this, that kind of independence and also that kind of visibility like open her up to, as we know, like very harsh and very rude criticism from people who were supposed to be part of her community and part of her activist community. And it's been, I think, also a legacy that the activist community has to deal with, that for a very, very long time, like, the idea of masculinity has ruled the idea of activism. So women being activists, being loud, being in charge in this moment was actually like signing up for a lot of people being mad at you, including the men who felt like you were supplanting them. So I think that it's a strategy and it's also a danger and it's also kind of a sacrifice too. As Sonia was saying, Gloria used to speak up on behalf of women that she knew who were abused. And that's an advocate position. And that's like what activism like really is advocacy. And so she's kind of like putting her face forward, putting her like persona forward to like be a shield to people who are not able to be as visible or who are being injured, right? And can't speak out publicly. I think that visibility is a tool. It can be a weapon. It's also a sacrifice,
Yeah, I like the way that you're presenting it, Gabby, as a sacrifice or as a risk-taking activity kind of thing. I think in my question I framed it as like a negative. What are the cons of like being visible? But I think, I was thinking of it in terms of the sacrifice required of an individual señora to take on this risk for like this broader community. But I guess we can also see it as, in contemporary terms, as a call in, right? Like as a it's a critique, but I am establishing myself as the point person. If you have questions about it, you can deal with me. And now you know who to like talk to, I guess, on the issue.
Yeah, like calling people in to a conversation instead of out, calling people out of the situation.
I think there's also a risk to be talked about with Carmen and with Gloria's visibility around the white community. Like thinking about Carmen being the mayor's secretary. I mean, when you think about the cons of visibility in that way, the desire for respectability feels so much more, I don't want to say valid, but like you understand them, right? Because you're entering into this very white space, especially for Carmen, and you have to navigate certain socializing that is different and maybe unfamiliar and is also heavily loaded. Like you're around people who have actual power to lash out in certain ways, to even like give you, more opportunities. There are so many different ways that being visible as a woman of Mexican descent in an Anglo space is a risk that they both took and continue to take. Like I'm thinking about Gloria's like later life when she worked for the police department. The risk of taking on that role in, I don't know if it was an Anglo-dominated space, but she definitely talked about it in terms of like the white officers around her. And just being that close to people who have a lot of power and thus a lot of space to abuse that power is very risky. And also have a history of doing it as well in both cities, both states.
I mean, I'm thinking about the ways that visibility continues to be risky and, puts you in an awkward position. I mean, as soon as you said, person of color in white spaces, I was like, grad school? Are we talking about academia right now? Um, so I think that to a certain extent, like visibility as a tool and visibility as risk taking continues to be a strategy that many of us are using, which is not to equate like like visibility is not the same as showing up for your community in material and tangible ways. I mean, in many cases it is. I think that in the cases of our señoras, it certainly was. But I think I just want to point out the fact that this is a conversation about representation, right? Does it really make a difference to have Latinos in politics or whatever? Probably concretely it does, but in the end, we're still working with the systematic issues rather than individual issues. So it's not like one Latino or one Chicana is gonna fix the entire pig system, to use Gloria's words, right? But I mean, that's the initial step: visibility, showing up, participating.
Well, this is why I think it's so important to think of this as like an ongoing evolution or a journey of political consciousness. Because if we stop at the end goal being visibility, the end goal being representation, if that's where we're like, we made it, we're here, we've done all we can do, there's something wrong with that, right? Like that's what you're pointing out, is like that's not enough to create material change for different marginalized communities. And so when the end goal is representation, you hit a wall eventually. And that's why the journey is so interesting, I think, because there's so many different horizons for each señora that we're talking about, so many different walls.
Yeah, like there's a lot of like studies done around this. I'm trying to remember the name of this book, but basically it talks about how when cultural studies departments were founded in universities, that was when a lot of the radical leaders of the separate like civil rights movements stopped fighting in a lot of ways, because some of them got absorbed into these cultural studies programs. And, it can be seen as a harsh critique, but I think it's also like a lesson to look at like what kind of fight do you want to lead? Because some people are very good at fighting within systems, right? But if you want to continue a civil rights kind of movement, we've seen it historically that it's probably not going to be within the same systems that define you as non-human. So getting a cultural studies program is a triumph, and cultural studies programs gave doctorates and bachelor's degrees to a lot of students who couldn't have otherwise gotten it. But it also does not mean that that was the avenue through which civil rights continued to evolve. Civil rights movements continued to evolve outside of that. And so a lot of universities and a lot of university structures, a lot of government structures wanted to, like, it was a very efficient way to kind of gather all of these like young radical people up and create it from them tools of that same system that they were fighting against. And that's also, interestingly, gonna get flagged. This is why also, like, the FBI, the CIA, they recruit from universities, people who are very bright, sometimes people who are very dissenting. And if they can get them to work for them, then that's ideal, because if you work for them, then they know what you're doing. So I think that this is all to say that when you gain visibility, when you gain representation, like you were saying, Sonia, what kind of representation, what kind of visibility, like, what are you saying? Like, have you changed what you're saying? Like, are you still fighting for your community? And I think that everyone's answer is different. Like, people within a system still may believe that they're fighting for their community, and that's okay. But if the goal is to create a new system or is to create a different world, then maybe the answer is outside of the existing one. Thanks for joining us on this Señora adventure. Before we end, we want to leave you with a little homework, a little question. What social clubs is your neighborhood Señora a part of? What social clubs can you be a part of?